The Second World War was truly global in scope. The First World War saw the majority of conflict on the European or Eurasian continent, with smaller skirmishes occurring in various spots around the world. But the Second World War consisted of two major theaters on the globe, those of the war in Europe and that of the war in the Pacific. As daunting as the Nazi occupation of the European continent was for the Allies, the Americans particularly faced another massive challenge in breaking Japanese domination in the Pacific. Since the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, and expanded operations across the Pacific, Imperial Japan had been gradually expanding its holdings and constructing an expansive island empire across an ocean. To defeat Japan and liberate much of the Far East from its ruthless imperialism, the American Army, Navy, and Marines would have to operate at the height of its ingenuity, resourcefulness, and strategic thinking. As the Nazis had justified their conquest in the name of obtaining Lebensraum, or living space, for the superior German, the Japanese defended their imperial conquest by formulating the idea of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The name of the Japanese Empire implied a multitude of Asian peoples and races living together in harmony and mutual prosperity. The propaganda was designed to keep non-Japanese people subservient to the Japanese Empire so that they would work and provide the raw materials needed to support the empire. This 1935 poster of Manchukuo promotes the idea of harmony between the Japanese, Chinese, and Manchu members. The caption written from the right to left says, "With the help of Japan, China, and Manchukuo, the world can be in peace." The reality of Japanese occupation for the Pacific Rim countries was, of course, far different than the propaganda suggested. Millions were tortured and slaughtered by their Japanese conquerors. Millions more lived in oppression as the Imperial Japanese government availed itself of whatever resources it deemed necessary. Racial antagonisms were certainly not healed by Japanese occupation, but rather made more intense and sharper than ever before. The myth of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was never believed by any of Japan's victims, but was rather a contrived excuse by the Japanese military to justify further expansion and terror. Some of the victims of Japanese oppression that tend to be forgotten were the so-called comfort women. These were girls and women selected from conquered populations to be consigned to sexual slavery for the benefit of Japanese soldiers. Comfort women were selected from a multitude of races and nationalities, but Korean, Chinese, and Filipino women were forced into the role in particularly large numbers. Estimates of the numbers of those forced into prostitution by the Japanese range between 50,000 and 200,000 women and girls. Indeed, many of the comfort women were minors. The Japanese military originally forced women into prostitution to reduce the incidences of rape and venereal disease in the Japanese military. But the brothels of comfort women actually increased episodes of rape and disease. The forced brothels in the Pacific War reveal another level of violence, that is, sexual violence, that was extensively prevalent during the war. Many of the victims would be denied recognition of the suffering they experienced for many decades after the war was over. Without question, the Japanese had struck a significant blow against the Americans in the sneak attack against Pearl Harbor. But as bad as the attack was, it could have been much worse. Most notably, none of the American aircraft carriers had been in port when the Japanese attacked. Losing some of the large flat tops would have significantly impaired the ability of the American Navy to move aggressively against Japan and would have set back the American campaign in the Pacific probably for years. The Japanese also did not significantly disable the important dry dock facilities at Pearl Harbor or systematically destroy the harbor's oil tank field, the very fuel of the Pacific Fleet. Even the battleships that the Japanese did succeed in striking, many of them were repaired and refitted and eventually saw action during the Pacific War. The most significant miscalculation for the Japanese, however, in the attack on Pearl Harbor was the degree to which Americans would be enraged by the attack and moved to exact revenge from Japan. The American campaign in the Pacific during World War II would put to rest the Japanese perception that Americans were a bunch of self-indulgent playboys who would not be able to endure the rigors of war. Pearl Harbor was not the only target for Japanese attack and expansion in December of 1941. The Japanese launched simultaneous attacks across the Pacific against individual islands, island groups, and descended on the South Pacific through the Philippines, Dutch East Indies, and Southeast Asia. In the late days of 1941 and early 1942, the Japanese seemed to be everywhere, and everywhere scoring another victory. The American territory of Wake Island surrendered to a Japanese invasion force on December 23, 1941. During its occupation in 1943, 98 American prisoners would be taken to the edge of the island, blindfolded, and executed. American forces on the island of Guam surrendered to the Japanese on December 10, 1941. The British garrison at Hong Kong surrendered to the Japanese on December 25, 1941. The Japanese overwhelmed British, Australian, Indian, and Malay forces in Malaya and moved rapidly down the peninsula. The British and Commonwealth forces became surrounded by Japanese forces and surrendered their 80,000-strong force to the Japanese on February 15, 1942. It was the largest surrender of British Commonwealth forces ever, and significantly damaged British imperial prestige in the area, which would have enormous post-war implications. The Japanese also started to move against the Philippines in the very next day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces were outnumbered in the islands, but their troops were better trained, experienced, and supplied than the defenders. The Japanese moved to secure the key islands and captured the capital of Manila before surrounding several thousand American and Filipino troops on the Bataan Peninsula. Bataan is a large peninsula that extends southward from the large island of Luzon into the South China Sea. It is a naturally defensive position that the Americans took advantage of. Heavy fighting occurred across the peninsula as the Japanese slowly choked off the supplies to the Americans and surrounded them. The longtime commander of American forces in the Philippines was the vainglorious General Douglas MacArthur. As senior Army commander in the Pacific Theater, MacArthur would play a critical role during the course of the American campaign to defeat the Japanese in the Pacific. MacArthur came from a notable military family. His grandfather had served during the American Civil War, and his father had won the Medal of Honor during the American conquest of the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century. Thereafter, the Philippines became an American colony. MacArthur graduated first in his West Point class of 1903. He served during World War I and saw combat in France, where he received the Distinguished Service Cross. After World War I, MacArthur served as superintendent of West Point and Secretary of the Army. He earned the opprobrium of the public in 1932 when he exceeded orders and drove the bonus army of World War I veterans from the steps of the Capitol and burned their dwellings. MacArthur was reassigned to the Philippines to prepare the American colony for independence by building and training their national army. Dwight Eisenhower served as his chief of staff during this task. The Philippines were on the verge of independence when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and then moved against the islands themselves. MacArthur coordinated the futile and ill-fated defense of the islands in the face of the Japanese onslaught. Not wanting such a high-ranking American general to be captured by the Japanese, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate the Philippines and the island outpost of Corregidor in March of 1942. An American fast-cruising PT boat raced through the Japanese blockade and escaped south to Australia. Arriving in Australia, MacArthur delivered a famous press conference in which he declared, "I came out of Bataan, and I shall return." That defiant promise of, "I shall return," was a promise that rallied American and Filipino forces for the next 2 years as they endured a brutal Japanese occupation and torturous prisoner of war camps. But in early 1942, particularly in the context of defeat and retreat before ever advancing Japanese forces, MacArthur's promise to return and liberate the Philippines seemed very remote. The Americans who were left behind after MacArthur's evacuation retreated to the island of Corregidor, located south of the Bataan Peninsula. The Americans and their Filipino allies endured constant air bombardment and survived for weeks with low ammunition, food, and other supplies. With no hope of reinforcements or relief, the garrison was forced to surrender to the Japanese in May of 1942. It was the largest defeat or surrender in American history. as 23,000 American troops and upwards of tens of thousands Filipino allies surrendered to the Japanese. The bombardment and deprivations the Americans had thus far experienced were rough, but certainly not as brutal as what was to come next. The Japanese imposed a forcible march on the tens of thousands of American and Filipino prisoners they now had in their possession. The conditions were so brutal, and the neglect and abuse from Japanese troops so egregious, that the infamous march would become known as the Bataan Death March. From the base of the Bataan Peninsula, tens of thousands were forced to walk on foot in the heat and humidity with very little water. Men that collapsed or stumbled or slowed were quickly punished by the Japanese guards. Food was inadequate, and prisoners were expected to walk great lengths each day on meager rations, as many of them became dehydrated. Japanese guards wantonly and recklessly killed prisoners for the slightest offenses. Men were beaten, whipped, kicked, cursed, or shot simply to instill fear in the other prisoners. Bodies were left where they dropped, or carelessly tossed aside. Japanese brutality during the 60-mile death march resulted in the deaths of somewhere between 5,000 and 18,000 victims. Those that did survive were confined to Japanese prisoner of war camps for the duration of the war, where they experienced terrible hunger, dehydration, abuse, and punishment. They would have to wait 3 long years for their liberation. With little to slow or stop them, the Japanese military was able to quickly descend onto the Dutch East Indies, capturing Borneo, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They looked to use their new lands to acquire the oil they would need to feed their war machine. The Japanese began to threaten the coast of Australia as well, executing the bombing of Darwin, Australia, on February 19, 1942. The Second World War would also be a national effort for Australians. The Japanese could never mount a full invasion of Australia, but thousands of Australians were captured as Japanese POWs during the course of the war. By the spring of 1942, Imperial Japan had reached the peak of its expansion across Asia and the Pacific. After attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese quickly moved into the Dutch East Indies in an effort to secure the oil resources they envisioned they would need to continually fuel their armies and navies. The Americans seemed to be on the run and flat on their backs after Pearl Harbor, with little chance of uprooting the Japanese anytime soon. To counteract the sense of defeat in America, President Roosevelt ordered the armed services to contrive of a means to hit back at homeland Japan. The American public needed a morale boost and a sense that it was on its way back to victory. In response to the president's request, an ambitious plan was hatched to accomplish the bombing of mainland Japan. This was an enormously audacious endeavor, as mainland Japan was thousands of miles away, well beyond the reach of large conventional bombers. A plan was hatched, however, that coordinated Army and Navy resources to work together to deliver Army bombers by aircraft carrier within striking distance of Japan so that they could hit the mainland. This had never been attempted before, and many did not think it could work. Conventional practice understood that Army bombers, such as the B-25 Mitchell, was too big, heavy, and slow to take off from the confined runway of an aircraft carrier. The challenge of this task fell to Army Colonel James Doolittle. Doolittle was a very experienced pilot who had studied aeronautics extensively, was a flight instructor during World War I, and had pioneered blind flying, by which a pilot relied solely on instruments rather than vision to reach his destination. He was determined to overcome the unprecedented challenges and succeed in the mission that was given to him. Doolittle personally selected the pilots and aircrews for the mission. Collectively, the men would become known as the Doolittle Raiders. Together, the crews worked extensively to strip down all non-essentials from their B-25s to reduce weight and enable the bombers to take off from a shortened runway. Gun turrets, shielding, and other devices were removed to reduce weight. Additional fuel cells were added to extend flight time. Most importantly, the pilots training at Eglin Airfield in Pensacola, Florida, had to train in order to take off with only about 200 feet of runway, similar to the length they would have on an aircraft carrier. Doolittle marked out 200 feet on a runway and continually challenged the pilots to remove further weight from their planes until they could manage to get aloft before their wheels hit the mark. Finally managing the short takeoffs, Doolittle's B-25s were loaded onto the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet and set sail north for Japan. Secrecy was imperative, for if the Japanese sighted the carrier and radioed the report back to Japan, Doolittle's raiders would lose the element of surprise and be sitting ducks in the air as they were to fly without fighter escorts. Fearing the carrier had been sighted, the raiders launched even earlier than they planned in the North Pacific. As the pitching deck of the carrier tossed up and down on the sea, the slow lumbering bombers ran down the flight deck and barely cleared the end of the carrier and almost plunged into the sea before becoming aloft and gaining altitude. It was the first carrier launch of medium-sized bombers in history, and all 16 Army bombers and 80 airmen successfully launched and headed towards Japan. The raiders knew they did not have enough fuel to fly all the way to Japan and then all the way back to the carrier. The plan was to fly to Japan, release their bombs on their targets, and then continue to fly and either crash into the Sea of Japan or land in Japanese-occupied Manchuria or China. Thus, once the Hornet launched the bombers, it turned south back to Hawaii, maintaining radio silence and not sure of the bomber's success. Doolittle's raiders made the 6-hour flight towards Japan without incident and without being spotted by Japanese ships or aircraft, and arrived over their targets on April 18, 1942. The raiders targeted industrial sites across Japan as well as the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. They dropped their bombs and then continued to fly west. The Doolittle Raid actually resulted in little damage. Several sites were hit but quickly recovered. Much to the embarrassment of the Japanese High Command, one bomb actually landed in the garden of the Emperor's Palace, putting the Divine Sovereign in jeopardy. The intention and greatest legacy of the raid was a psychological blow against Japan, that the homeland could be reached and attacked. It was a huge morale boost for the Americans, that for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans had struck back against the enemy. 14 of the 16 Doolittle Raider crews managed to return to the United States. One of the crews was killed in combat. Only one of the 16 crews managed to land safely in the Soviet Union. 8 of the U.S. aviators were captured by the Japanese. 3 of them were executed. Colonel Doolittle received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroism in leading the raid. For decades to come, the surviving Doolittle Raiders had a ceremonial goblet engraved with their name. Every year, the surviving raiders would come together and drink a toast to their lost comrades. Every time a Doolittle Raider passed away, their respective goblet would be turned upside down. A final reunion among the surviving raiders was held in 2013. The last Doolittle Raider died in 2019 at the age of 103. The goblets are now located at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. After the debacle of Pearl Harbor, a new admiral was put in command of the United States Pacific Fleet. Chester W. Nimitz was the son of German-American parents from Fredericksburg, Texas, born in 1885. After receiving an appointment to the United States Naval Academy, Nimitz graduated 7th in his class of 114 in 1905. Nimitz made a name for himself in the interwar Navy as an effective submarine commander and pioneered new means to conduct underwater replenishment techniques to enable naval vessels to conduct longer voyages. When he arrived at Pearl Harbor in late December 1941, he inherited a broken, burning, demoralized fleet that he needed to quickly salvage, repair, set sail, and use to strike back at the Japanese. Admiral Nimitz was particularly aided in his forthcoming Pacific campaign against the Japanese by Magic. Magic was the code name for the secret U.S. operation to decipher Japanese codes. Whereas the British had successfully cracked the Enigma machines at Bletchley Park, the Americans, particularly in Hawaii, worked extensively to crack the Japanese Army and Navy code. Edwin Layton was Nimitz's chief intelligence officer. He had lived in Japan before the war and became familiar with some of the intelligence work of the Japanese. His trusted assistant was an eccentric and reclusive crypto analyst named Joe Rocheford. Joe Rocheford had a photographic memory and he used unconventional means to remember and crack portions of the Japanese naval code. While his superiors thought his means were unorthodox, he continued to prove his reliability and accuracy. By the spring of 1942, the American Navy was still spoiling for a fight against the Japanese carrier force to level some blows against the Japanese Navy. American codebreakers started to prove their usefulness and accuracy by decoding messages that the Japanese carriers were moving into the Solomon Islands, just north of Australia, in preparation for probably an attack against Port Moresby on New Guinea. Two American carrier task forces raced to the Coral Sea in the South Pacific in order to thwart the Japanese advance. One American task force comprised the USS Lexington, and the other, the USS Yorktown. The Japanese entered the Coral Sea with two large carriers and one smaller carrier, along with several other ships. When the two sides met in May of 1942 in the Coral Sea, the engagement was the first carrier-based battle in world history. Neither side's carriers actually ever saw each other or were in view, but rather their respective dive bombers and torpedo bombers flew hundreds of miles across the sea to engage each other's ships. The two sides spent dozens of hours simply trying to find each other in the vast sea. Radar still remained primitive, weather conditions obscured visibility, and pilots often searched fruitlessly for each other's fleet. Finally, the Americans identified and bombed the smaller Japanese carrier, sending it to the bottom while still on fire. The air wings of the two larger carriers did not find each other until May 7th. Once again, dive bombers and torpedo bombers were launched to attack enemy ships as well as fighter squadrons to defend one's own ships. Japanese fighter pilots and cloud cover hampered the American attacks on the Japanese carriers, but the Americans did successfully bomb the large carrier Shikaku in the Coral Sea, rendering her unable to launch or land planes because her flight deck had been so badly damaged. Later the same day, Japanese pilots found the USS Lexington and USS Yorktown on the open sea in a clear sunlit sky. The dive bombers and torpedo bombers descended on the carriers. Quickly and nimbly, carrier commanders ordered their ships to move and dodge oncoming attackers, but too many Japanese pilots descended on the American ships. The Yorktown took several bombs that landed on its flight deck and even exploded beneath deck. The dead and injured were everywhere. The Yorktown was losing oil, but kept up steady steam. The Lexington would not fare as well. The slower and lumbering ship took hits from several bombs and torpedoes and began to list. Officers were slowly able to right the ship and keep it under power, but a series of explosions continued to rock the ship, and fires became numerous and impossible to put out. Finally, the decision was made to scuttle the ship, and most of its crew jumped into the sea and was rescued. The Lexington was intentionally finished off with American torpedoes to make sure it sank to the bottom. The Battle of the Coral Sea provided cause for celebration and concern on both sides. The Americans had lost a major carrier and some other supply ships, along with several crew and pilots. The Japanese, however, had lost a small carrier, suffered major damage to a large carrier, and also lost other support ships. The Battle of the Coral Sea effectively blocked any further advancement of Japanese forces, particularly in the South Pacific, and certainly towards Australia. The Japanese also lost some of its best pilots in the conflict, establishing a parity with American pilots that would prove significant in subsequent engagements. Looking to complete the task that was not accomplished at Pearl Harbor, namely the destruction of the American aircraft carriers, Japanese Naval Command formulated an ambitious plan to lure the carriers out into the open ocean where they could be destroyed. The bait for this trap would be the island of Midway. Midway Atoll is a small two-island formation almost at the midpoint between North America and Asia. It had been claimed as an American possession since the 19th century. A small Army Air Corps landing strip and air group had been established on the island before the war. The Japanese planned an amphibious invasion of the island that would provide the bait to draw a response from the Americans. Waiting behind the invasion force would be a large Japanese carrier strike force that would catch the Americans off guard and destroy them before they realized the trap into which they had entered. The element of surprise was essential to Japanese success. Unaware that their code had been cracked, The Japanese saw no reason why the Americans would anticipate their plan. Japanese encrypted code messages continued to mention the letters AF as the next target of a large strike force. To prove that his team of cryptologists were correct reading the Japanese code, Joe Rocheford instructed the occupants of Midway to send out a false emergency message that their water plant was broken, even though it wasn't. When American cryptologists proceeded to read and decipher Japanese code that the water plant at AF was broken, they knew the target of the Japanese plan. The Japanese could not have known that their naval code had been cracked and that the Americans had set a trap of their own. As the Japanese carriers moved toward Midway from the west, the American carriers would be lying in wait for them northeast of Midway. The Japanese Kido Butte, or Carrier Strike Force, was composed of numerous supply and support ships, as well as submarines, cruisers, destroyers, and battleships. But the core of the fleet, and its most valuable asset, was its 4 aircraft carriers, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Akagi, and the Hiryu. All 4 had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, and now all 4 would be involved in the Midway operation. The Kido Butte was commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Nagumo was a traditional naval officer who had little knowledge or experience in naval aviation and its capabilities. He was known as a by-the-book type of commander who would struggle to adjust and adapt during the heat of battle. Early on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the primitive radar system on Midway Island detected incoming aircraft. Shortly after 6 a.m., Japanese bombers and fighters attacked the atoll. The Japanese bombed the hangar and aircraft facilities on the island, and fighters strafed its defenders. Significant damage was done to the facilities, but the airfields and refueling capabilities of Midway were still intact and functional. Japanese bombers noticed something curious, however, when they conducted their attack on the island. The aircraft, fighters, and bombers were expected to be there were absent. Japanese pilots began to wonder where the aircraft were and were the Americans aware their fleet was in the vicinity. If the Americans knew they were coming, it could mean the Japanese had lost all element of surprise. In any case, Japanese pilots radioed back to their carriers recommending another bombing run against Midway. The Japanese aircraft carrier crews immediately began arming planes with land bombs. As in the Battle of the Coral Sea, 2 naval fleets would engage each other in battle without ever seeing each other. It was their respective aircraft that would do the fighting. While the Japanese naval air fleet featured torpedo and dive bombers, it was best known for its fighters. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 was the absolute best fighter aircraft in the world at the beginning of the war. The Zero could fly at longer distances than other fighters, and its speed and maneuverability made it superior in dogfighting. As Japanese bombers started to return to their carriers, a scout plane informed Admiral Nagumo that American ships were in the area. This raised the possibility for Nagumo that the American carriers were also present. Admiral Nagumo now faced a critical dilemma. He could launch a limited strike and move immediately against the American carriers in the area, or he could land the returning strike force from Midway, refuel, and properly arm them with bombs and torpedoes for a sea strike. Should he do a land strike or a sea strike? Japanese naval doctrine mandated that Nagumo only launch full strikes and not partial, and therefore he decided to land his returning strike force and order his carrier crews to change gears and remove the land bombs and replace them with bombs and torpedoes for a sea strike. The transition from land ordnance to sea ordnance would take up to 2 hours, and thousands of pounds of ordnance would be exposed and unsecured on board the carrier hangar decks below during the process, leaving the Japanese carrier seriously vulnerable. Admiral Nagumo, however, believed the transition in weapons could be completed before any American air crews arrived. The Japanese pilots that attacked the atoll did not see the American planes below because they had already been scrambled to attack the Japanese fleet. A group of B-17 bombers were positioned on Midway before the battle, and they were the first to engage the Japanese fleet, endeavoring to bomb the fleet from above. The slow, lumbering bombers, however, flew at such a high altitude that all of their bombs missed the zigzagging ships below, and many were destroyed by Japanese fighters or ran out of gas to be effective. Bombers like the B-17s were often accompanied into battle by the American Wildcat fighter to protect the slow bombers. At the beginning of the war, however, routinely Wildcats were shot down at a higher rate than Japanese fighters as they were slower and American pilots less experienced. Once the Japanese fleet was located west of Midway, the American carriers launched their Devastator torpedo bombers in an effort to destroy the Japanese carriers. The results, however, were catastrophic for the Americans. 41 torpedo bombers registered 0 hits against the Japanese fleet. Most of them reported defective torpedoes that would not detonate or even launch. Almost all of them were wiped out by Japanese fighters or ditched in the sea, running out of gas. The only remaining hope for the Americans to score a victory against the Japanese fleet would be their dauntless dive bombers. The dive bombers would descend from high altitudes of 20,000 feet at a 70-degree angle at over 200 miles per hour directly over a ship. At the last moment, at approximately 1,500 feet, the pilot would release his single bomb and pull up his aircraft, hoping for a direct hit below. Around 8 a.m. on June 4th, almost 70 American dive bombers took off from the decks of the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown and set out searching for the Japanese fleet. The dive bombers flew for 2 hours across the featureless ocean, searching but finding nothing. They were running low on fuel and approaching the moment they needed to turn back towards their carriers to land safely. Shortly after 10 a.m., however, the air group leaders spotted a rainbow on the horizon. The spectrum of color was cast by the water spout from the Japanese destroyer Arashi, which had unsuccessfully attempted to depth charge the American submarine Nautilus earlier that morning. Because the Arashi had lagged behind the rest of the Japanese fleet, the ship steamed at full power to catch up, leaving a large wake behind it. The wake essentially formed an arrow that pointed in the precise direction of the Japanese fleet. The Americans simply followed the wake for 20 minutes, and then they could see the large Japanese ships in the distance. Dozens of American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown now converged on the Japanese carriers below. At 10:25 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, the Japanese were unquestionably winning the war in the Pacific and on the verge of scoring another blow against the Americans at Midway. 5 minutes later, the entire Pacific War had changed, and the Japanese were dealt a devastating blow. American pilots turned into their descents towards the carriers below. The Zero interceptor fighters were not in the area as they were destroying the remnants of the earlier torpedo bomber strike. Screeching down to the carriers below at 200 miles per hour, the dive bombers dodged and deflected all the anti-aircraft flak the Japanese could muster. Even as the fuselages took numerous bullet hits, they continued to descend on the carriers. Finally, at the last possible moments, pilots pushed a button, releasing the single 1,000-pound bomb they carried, aiming it for the flight deck below them even as they slammed back their control sticks to pull up just in time. The results were devastating. Bombs dropped with frightening rapidity on the Kaga and the Soryu below. Flight decks rippled and rolled up and blew off into the sea. Hangars loaded with men, planes, fuel lines, and ordnance were blasted into oblivion. Entire carriers convulsed and shook from the explosions and immediately became a floating fireball filled with smoke, wreckage, and dead sailors. American pilots looked back over their shoulders to see the effectiveness of their dives, and all they could see were enormous plumes of black smoke and fire. Admiral Nagumo's decision to change ordnance from land to sea weapons below decks was catastrophic. All types of bombs and torpedoes were in various stages of being loaded and unloaded and lying about the hangar decks. Any American bomb that came close to the hangar decks instantly set off a massive explosion that continued to explode inside the hull of the ship and up onto the flight deck. The most singular example of this was the dive bomb run of Commander Dick Best. Best descended on the Akagi with 2 wingmen. His 2 wingmen landed their bombs in the water next to the Akagi. Best scored the only direct hit. Landing a bomb directly on the flight deck, the bomb penetrated the wooden deck and exploded in the hangar deck. Immediately, all the exposed ordnance and fuel lines lying about went up in a massive explosion. Best's single bomb detonated all the other ordnance on board the Akagi and doomed the carrier. Thus, Best was singularly responsible for sinking an entire Japanese carrier. Thus, in the space of 5 minutes, with the destruction of 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, the Soryu, the Kaga, and the Akagi, the entire war in the Pacific had changed. The Japanese had lost all strategic advantage in the battle and their ability for future offensive operations. Hundreds of trained and experienced Japanese pilots went down with their carriers, or were forced to ditch their planes in the sea with the destruction of their home carrier. American dive bombers would return later the same afternoon and also destroy the 4th carrier of the Huryu, raising the number of Japanese carriers destroyed to a startling 4. Once again, American pilot Dick Best was instrumental in bombing the Huryu, which meant he was instrumental in the sinking of 2 carriers on the same day. The biggest loss of the same day was the USS Yorktown, which Japanese pilots managed to bomb and then torpedo. Initially, its crew believed the ship could be saved, but a subsequent torpedo strike by a Japanese submarine doomed the American carrier to the depths below. As a consequence of the battle, the Americans lost 1 fleet carrier in the Yorktown, 1 destroyer sunk, and 150 aircraft. 307 Americans were killed in the course of the Battle of Midway. The losses for the Japanese were far greater. The Japanese combined fleet lost 4 large fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and significant damage to another, and 248 aircraft destroyed. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were captured by battle's end. The consequences of the Battle of Midway were immense. Any possible advantage the Japanese had secured by its sneak attack on Pearl Harbor was lost. In a single day, the Japanese had lost any future ability to conduct further invasions and would now have to focus on defense of its empire, with the Americans gaining the upper hand to move freely about the Pacific. The U.S. Army and Navy devised a plan to work separately, yet together, for the destruction of the Japanese Empire. The plan became known as island hopping, in which the 2 branches of service would work to conquer 1 island or island group at a time as necessary to move closer to the conquest of Japan. Particularly, islands that featured a large landing strip or housed significant parts of the Japanese supply line would be targeted first. Islands that may have been occupied by the Japanese but not considered essential for the war effort would be bypassed. In large part, the U.S. Army would focus on the land campaigns further west on the Asian mainland and the Philippines, while the Navy would secure the seas from the remaining Japanese fleet and land Marines to take the islands that were judged to be essential. Admiral Nimitz, as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, would coordinate the island hopping, while senior-ranking Army General Douglas MacArthur would plan and execute the Army's land campaigns further west. Victories at Coral Sea and Midway gave the Americans the upper hand to conduct offensive operations against the sprawling Japanese empire across the Pacific. The Americans became concerned as the Japanese moved into the Solomon Islands and started constructing an airfield on the tiny island of Guadalcanal. A functioning airfield on Guadalcanal would enable the Japanese to launch long-distance bombers that could not only bomb the populous areas of Australia, but also disrupt the American supply chain in sea lanes between Hawaii and Australia. Seeking to prevent any further encroachment of Japan towards Australia, and to secure a jumping-off point for further operations in New Britain, New Guinea, and surrounding islands, the Navy and Marines set its sights on the small island of Guadalcanal, located in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese would regularly send supply ships down the middle of the Solomon Islands to supply outposts and bases throughout the island chain in a sea lane that became known as the Slot. The regular evening fleets were nicknamed the Tokyo Express. The campaign in the Solomon Islands would become so extensive that it would involve multiple land, air, and sea battles up and down the island chain. So many ships would be sunk in the slot that it would become known as Iron Bottom Bay. In August of 1942, two American invasion forces moved under the cover of bad weather to the north of Guadalcanal and landed troops on multiple islands. The Japanese seaplane base at Tulagi was quickly taken, and U.S. Marines moved quickly towards the airstrip on Guadalcanal. The Marines landing at Guadalcanal encountered light resistance, which they quickly overcame. The landings at Guadalcanal forecasted future American landings in the Pacific, wherein the defending Japanese would allow the invaders to land and amass on the beach before moving against them to destroy them. In contrast, German defenders in Europe would endeavor to prevent an amphibious landing from ever occurring and establishing a beachhead. The second day after the landings, the Americans secured control of the airstrip on Guadalcanal. Japanese and Korean construction workers had been scared away by the preliminary air bombardment and retreated several miles away from the airstrip. The Americans quickly worked to repair the airfield and succeeded in getting it operational a few days after landing. They renamed the airstrip Henderson Field after an American pilot lost during the Battle of Midway. Quickly, the Americans loaded Henderson Field with aircraft, nicknaming its Air Force the Cactus Air Force. The 11,000 Marines now on Guadalcanal moved into the jungle to establish a perimeter around the airstrip to protect it from the waves of Japanese attacks they knew would come out of the jungle. Adding to the challenge, the supporting naval fleet withdrew from the slot, fearing further attacks by Japanese aircraft and superior vessels. This left the Marines on Guadalcanal with limited food and supplies and surrounded by the Japanese on land and sea. To conserve supplies, Marines were limited to 2 meals per day. Adding to the challenge, after a significant engagement to the northwest of Guadalcanal, the United States Navy decided to withdraw its fleet from the slot, fearing additional further attacks by Japanese aircraft and superior vessels. This left the Marines on Guadalcanal with limited food and supplies and surrounded by the Japanese on land and sea. To conserve supplies, Marines were limited to 2 meals per day. To make matters worse, a severe strain of dysentery broke out among the Marines, with 1 in 5 being afflicted and out of action. The Japanese landed nearly 1,000 reinforcements east of the American perimeter and then commenced a march west. Underestimating American strength, on August 21st, the Japanese launched a full frontal assault at the mouth of the Tanaru River, nicknamed Alligator Creek for its presence of alligators. After the assault, a staggering 789 Japanese soldiers lay dead at the mouth of the Tanaru River. The slaughter was immense, with Japanese purposely conducting banzai charges straight into American machine gun positions. The Marines' perimeter held after the first concerted Japanese assault. While the Marines held their position on Guadalcanal, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto once again gave Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo another carrier fleet with which to duel the Americans. This time Nagumo, the defeated admiral at Midway, would be in command of 2 large carriers and a light carrier. The U.S. carriers of Enterprise and Saratoga were also in the area. Both carrier fleets launched their aircraft and labored to strike each other's fleets. The Americans succeeded in sinking the Japanese light carrier, and the Japanese managed to damage the Enterprise. The Japanese did not press the attack, and the Marines continued the struggle for control of Guadalcanal. The Navy managed to resupply the Marines with food, ammunition, and medicine during the day, and the Tokyo Express would travel down the slot at night to bring more reinforcements to the Japanese on Guadalcanal at night. Determined to drive back the American Marines and retake control of the airfield, the Japanese planned a 3-pronged attack against a ridge south of the airfield that consisted of a long 1,000-foot grassy area and natural coral formation. Lieutenant Merritt Edson commanded 830 Marines against a pending attack of 3,000 Japanese. The Japanese assault along what became known as Edson's Ridge would see some of the fiercest fighting during the Guadalcanal campaign. On the night of September 12th, shortly after dark, 3,000 Japanese soldiers rushed Edson's Ridge and the Marines defending it. Charging the open field and directly towards the Americans dug into the ridge, the Marines fired as fast as possible and nearly could not miss with the oncoming Japanese. Wave after wave of Japanese fighters came against the Marines. Charging Japanese tripped over their own comrades who moments before fell before them. Americans and Japanese were often face to face with each other. Men were shot at point-blank range. American gunners struggled to reload fast enough to match the incoming assault. Hand-to-hand fighting was frequent. Eventually, so many Japanese had been cut down in the field, the bodies stacked up, preventing another wave of attack. The Marines succeeded in killing 850 Japanese fighters over 3 nights of attack. The Marines lost 104 of their own men. After additional battles on the sea and in the air, the Japanese managed to reinforce its troops on the island to launch a final push to drive the Americans off the airfield. Total Japanese troop numbers approached 20,000. The Japanese believed the Americans only numbered 10,000. In reality, the Marines on Guadalcanal now numbered around 23,000, defending the perimeter around the airfield. Although planning a concerted attack against the American perimeter, communications between the Japanese forces broke down and its western force attacking early. Able to concentrate their fire to the west, the Americans were able to nearly wipe them out. A full day late, the southern Japanese force attacked on October 24th and 25th. Once again, with wave after wave of banzai charges, Japanese soldiers charged the dug-in Marines and were cut down in large numbers. The air was full of bullets, grenades, and mortar shells headed in both directions. The Americans could not fire fast enough at times to hold back the thousands of attackers. Some Japanese units actually made it behind the American lines before they were spotted and eliminated. By the end of 3 days of fighting, much of it again throughout the night in the jungle, the Japanese had lost between 2,000 and 3,000 troops. The Americans had lost 80. In the middle of the action, defending the airfield was Staff Sergeant John Basilone. Basilone kept multiple machine guns going throughout the 3 days of fighting. When one gun ran out of ammunition, he would find additional ammo elsewhere. He continued to repair jammed guns and move them to gain a better line of sight. When his last gun ran out of ammunition, Basilone used his pistol and machete to still hold off the Japanese until reinforcements arrived. For his heroism and valor, Basilone was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was returned to the United States to participate on a war bonds tour and tell his story. But as we shall see, he does not remain content being on the American home front raising money for war bonds and decides to return to the Pacific Theater later in the war. Once again defeated on land, the Japanese once again turned to the seas in an effort to secure victory in the Solomon Islands campaign. Twin fleets of the Japanese and Americans, both with 2 carriers apiece, once again met each other in the southern Solomons and engaged each other at a distance through naval aviation. The Americans suffered significant damage on board the Enterprise, and the Japanese managed to sink the Hornet. The 2 Japanese carriers were damaged, but far worse were the numerous losses the Japanese suffered again among their most trained and experienced aviators. The Japanese loss of such a critical asset would provide the Americans with a great strategic advantage for the remainder of the Pacific War. Defeating the Japanese onslaughts, the Americans were able to go on the offensive and into the jungle to root out remaining Japanese battalions. To the west was particularly grueling terrain composed of mountains, thick brush, rivers, and dense jungle. American Marines had to scale large hills and small rocky mountains, particularly Mount Austin, to root out the heavily fortified Japanese in the hills. They often did so without adequate water in the intense heat and humidity. The Marines slowly made their way, dislodging the Japanese wherever they were found. In late 1942 and into 1943, the Japanese continually tried to reinforce and resupply their troops on Guadalcanal. Increasingly, however, once the Tokyo Express came down the slot, they were met by American battleships and destroyers. Naval losses were heavy on both sides, but Japan could not sustain such losses in the area. With such meager rations and ammunition left for the troops on the island, Japan decided to withdraw secretly from the island and completed doing so successfully by February 7, 1943, 6 months to the day since the Americans had landed. American losses from the Battle of Guadalcanal approximated 7,000 dead and 7,000 wounded. 29 ships were lost in the campaign. For the Japanese, the losses were much greater, 19,000 dead, with the majority of them killed due to tropical diseases. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 1,000 ships during the campaign. The victory at Guadalcanal marked the beginning of major American offensive operations in the Pacific. Securing the Solomon Islands would provide the jumping-off point for American forces to continue their move north against the Japanese Empire. Another significant event in the American campaign to conquer the Solomon Islands occurred in August of 1943. Patrol torpedo, or PT, boats were used extensively in the campaign. The PT boats had little armor, but were fast, turned quickly, and could launch several torpedoes against larger ships in the slot of the Solomons. A young lieutenant named John F. Kennedy was given command of one of these PT boats, the PT-109, and regularly patrolled the slot with other boats during the course of the Solomons campaign. In the middle of the night, on August 2, 1943, Kennedy and his crew were slowly moving through the area. The engines were idling, and the PT-109 entered some low-lying fog. Suddenly, Kennedy's crew saw a Japanese destroyer rapidly approaching their boat out of the darkness. The crew only had a few seconds to respond, not enough time to fire on the destroyer or accelerate the engines to maneuver. At about 2:30 in the morning, the Japanese destroyer Amagiri rammed the PT-109 on its starboard side at a 20-degree angle. The entire right side of the PT-109 was ripped off, and the aviation fuel the 109 was carrying exploded in a massive fireball. The Amagiri continued on into the night. Some of the crew of the 109 were immediately killed. Others had serious burns all over their bodies, and others, like Kennedy, were relatively uninjured. For hours in the water and in the darkness, the remaining crew worked to hold on to debris and remain afloat. As the sun came up the next morning, the crew still hung on to the half of the PT-109 that remained buoyant, but realized it was taking on more water and would soon sink. Kennedy and his crew decided to swim for the nearest island. Kennedy, who had been on the Harvard swim team in college, personally put a life jacket strap in his mouth and towed a severely burned crewman through the water toward the island. The rest of the crew followed. They arrived at a very small island, but realized it contained no food or water. The crew decided to continue on to another island, where they located some coconuts, but still no fresh water. Still endeavoring to avoid being sighted by the Japanese, Kennedy would swim out into the channel away from the island in the middle of the night, hoping to signal a passing American ships, even as the sharks in the bay would surround him. Kennedy was not able to flag a passing American ship, but the crew did encounter some local islanders who offered food and water to the Americans. They were also willing to help the Americans, as the Japanese had occupied their islands and killed many of their own people. Realizing the islanders were in touch with coastal watchers, Kennedy decided to send a unique message to secure the rescue of his crew. Kennedy took a coconut and his service knife and carved a message. The message read, "Naro Island, Commander, native knows position. He can pilot. 11 alive. Need small boat. Kennedy." The natives covertly took the coconut to an Australian coastal watcher and informed the Americans that Kennedy and his crew were alive. 6 days after the destruction of the PT-109, the remaining crew was rescued. Kennedy was honored for his heroics during the wreck of the PT-109, and the story of his heroism was published in Reader's Digest. It was the first event that brought national attention to John Kennedy and catapulted him into a career in politics that would, of course, climax in him being elected the 35th President of the United States in 1960. A significant reason for eventual American success in the Pacific was the covert campaign beneath the waves conducted by the American submarine fleet. American submarines initially struggled to sink any ships during the first year of the Pacific campaign due to defective torpedoes which would not explode upon contact. Eventually rectifying the issue, American subs specifically targeted Japanese shipping as a means to weaken the enemy and constrict supplies being sent to the homeland. American submarines were responsible for 55% of the losses in Japan's merchant marine during the war, with other navies, such as those of the Royal Navy and Royal Netherlands, inflicting additional losses. American submarines also played an important role in the final campaigns of the war, including the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Several hundred miles to the northeast of the Solomons, the United States Navy launched its island campaign by targeting strategic outposts in both the Gilbert and Marshall Island chains. Thousands of islands lay between the Allies in the South Pacific and the Japanese homeland in the north, and many of them were garrisoned by Japanese troops and well defended. The Navy, however, targeted those islands they judged to be strategically necessary for the furtherance of the campaign. Often the selected islands were those that contained an airstrip. That was certainly the case with the Tarawa Atoll, which lay amidst the Gilbert Islands in the South Pacific. The atoll and its accompanying coral provided a valuable and strategic lagoon, and the large North Tarawa Island included a valuable landing field that, if taken away from the Japanese, would support additional Allied operations for the campaign ahead. Aerial reconnaissance had informed Navy warplanners that Tarawa was surrounded by an extended coral reef, but it was unclear how far the coral extended and how deep it was. The Navy hoped that the tide would provide a few feet of water to provide buoyancy for incoming craft, and that the Marines would be able to land on sand rather than the coral. In reality, Tarawa was the exact opposite. The long stretch of coral that extended from the island mainland was not only shallow, but completely exposed, treacherous to navigate, and razor sharp. Landing Marines would be completely exposed as they endeavored to head towards the island. The men struggled to walk and certainly could not run across the coral. At times, it was so sharp that it would cut and pierce boots. Beyond the jagged coral reef, the Japanese had constructed an elaborate network of 500 pillboxes, foxholes, bunkers, mortar emplacements, and machine gun nests throughout the island. They were the most extensive fortifications the Marines had yet to encounter in the Pacific War. For all these reasons, the Battle of Tarawa became known as Bloody Tarawa. Landing at Tarawa was nothing like the walk up the beach that had occurred at Guadalcanal. The Japanese rained down mortars and shells against the incoming landing craft loaded with Marines. Landing craft got stuck on the coral, unable to move. Still hundreds of yards from the beach, Marines had to move, completely exposed, across the coral to the landing beach. Others crawled and jumped over the side of their craft. Small arms fire and machine gun bursts decimated the vulnerable troops. The Marines going ashore at Tarawa were optimistic the landing would be made much easier by the inclusion of LVTs, landing vehicle tanks, nicknamed alligators by the troops. These were amphibious armored vehicles that would provide cover and move troops ashore. The so-called alligators, however, were of limited assistance on the day of the landings. Many of the vehicles also got hung up on the coral and couldn't move closer to the island. Others stalled or were stuck by shells. Soon became death traps for Marines inside. Others could not get over the high seawall at the end of some sectors. Some of the alligators did get ashore, however, and provided a measure of assistance for the Marines behind them. Many of the Marines, however, were pinned down and left vulnerable to Japanese mortar attacks. Bodies fell everywhere, and the dead and dying lay strewn across the coral and the beaches. Inch by inch, the remaining Marines made it across the coral and over the seawall after keeping up a steady stream of machine gun fire, grenades, and flamethrowers. Once the Marines made it onto the island, however, they faced one Japanese obstruction after another. Machine gun nests were buried and nestled into the island's grasses. Snipers fired from palm trees. Pillboxes were buried beneath the sand. Sometimes Marines could not see a gun pit that was only 6 feet away. As the Marines made progress across the island with more reinforcements, many of the occupiers committed seppuku, or ritual suicide, rather than the embarrassment of surrendering to the enemy. The struggle for Tarawa took place over 4 long, bloody days across a tiny island only 2 miles long and 1,500 feet wide. Taking Tarawa would cost 1,000 American lives with an additional 2,000 wounded. Nearly 5,000 Japanese were killed on the island, with only 17 being taken as prisoner. The bloody quarrel of Tarawa would teach the Navy the importance of pre-invasion intelligence and better awareness of what kind of conditions Marines would face at a potential landing site. In the future, frogmen, early Navy SEALs, would covertly swim offshore of potential invasion beaches to assess conditions before thousands of men were carelessly sent to their death. A number of lessons learned at Tarawa were employed in the subsequent invasion of another Japanese stronghold located at Kwajalein Island. Kwajalein Atoll is one of the largest atolls in the Marshall Island chain, and the main island within the atoll and the object of American attack was a little over 1 square mile. American Marines employed the lessons learned at Tarawa, found more suitable landing beaches, and used dual landings to overwhelm the occupying Japanese on the island. The Japanese fought with tremendous tenacity, despite being overwhelmed and outnumbered by close to 10 to 1. The vast majority of Japanese refused to surrender, and thus only 51 survived out of a garrison that originally numbered about 3,500. After navigating the Gilbert and the Marshall Islands, the Americans moved ever closer to mainland Japan at sea with the Navy and Marines by now concentrating on the Mariana Islands. The main island of the Marianas that the Americans found important was the island of Saipan. Now that the Americans had broken through the defensive perimeter of the Japanese Empire in the Pacific, they continued to move closer, ever closer to mainland Japan. Although not originally an objective for naval planners, the Marianas island chain would present several benefits to American forces if they were to be taken away from the Japanese. Capture of the Marianas would break Japan's contact with its remaining southern forces. Seizing the large island of Saipan in the Marianas would provide a sufficiently long airfield to launch and land B-29 superfortresses, bombers, that could manage the long flight to Japan, bomb the homeland, and then return to Saipan. On June 13th, naval battleships commenced a shore bombardment against Saipan to soften up its defenses. The 16-inch shells were designed to reduce as much of Saipan's defenses as possible. 4 of the battleships that took part in the bombardment were survivors of Pearl Harbor: the California, the Pennsylvania, the Maryland, and the Tennessee. Landings commenced at 7 a.m. on June 15, 1944, with 300 LVTs transporting 8,000 Marines on the west coast of Saipan. By the end of the first day, the Marines had secured a 6-mile-long beachhead on Saipan. The dense mountains, cliffs, caves, and tunnels on Saipan provided an abundance of firing nests for the Japanese to use against the invading Marines. The Marines made slow progress north on the island, flushing out the occupiers with machine gun bursts and use of flamethrower units. Reacting in desperation and completely outnumbered, remaining Japanese troops, including the wounded and civilians, conducted the largest banzai attack of the war against well-armed Marines. Hundreds were wiped out as the Japanese refused to surrender to the Americans. Realizing their defeat, the commanders of the Japanese garrison committed seppuku, ritual suicide, to avoid the disgrace of surrendering to the Americans. Also committing suicide to avoid capture was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and had lost 4 carriers at Midway. Now suffering yet another defeat at the hands of the Americans, Nagumo took his own life in an isolated cave on Saipan. Simultaneous to the American landings on Saipan, the Japanese resolved to thwart the American operation by amassing a large fleet to the west that would strike at the Americans when they were concentrating on the Saipan landings. This large naval force, assembled by the Japanese, included 9 small to large aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and more than 400 planes. What was to be a surprise strike against the Saipan landing fleet, however, turned out not to be so secretive. Because the Americans had perfected the onboard radar systems on their carriers and had successfully integrated radar intelligence with fighter control systems, the Americans knew the Japanese fleet and air squadrons were coming against them. The Japanese and American air squadrons met above the seas west of the Marianas. At the beginning of the war, Japanese aviators were the premier fighters in the world. But after the immense losses in the Coral Sea and at Midway, the Japanese no longer held such an advantage. American pilots were now better trained and more experienced, and the results showed in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19, 1944. So named because one American pilot remarked, "It's just like shooting turkeys." The conflict and the battle in the skies over the Marianas wasn't even close. Out of 373 Japanese aircraft that were launched in just 3 hours, an unbelievable 243 were shot out of the skies. It would be the greatest single loss of naval air power in history. After wiping out the Japanese air squadrons, the American pilots proceeded to attack the Japanese fleet, inflicting heavy losses on the surface ships as well. The Japanese plan to prevent the American conquest of Saipan was now hopeless. Over 20,000 civilians lived on the island of Saipan before the American invasion. Informed by an abundance of propaganda that declared the attacking Americans would rape and eat Japanese women and children if they surrendered, up to 1,000 Japanese residents on Saipan committed suicide by jumping off the high cliffs of the island. Very few prisoners were taken by the Japanese as a result. American casualties were half those of the Japanese, and the Americans suffered 3,400 soldiers killed in action, while the Japanese suffered 24,000 killed in action. With the capture of Saipan in the Marianas, the United States was now within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. B-29 Superfortress bombers, which were produced in record numbers on the home front, were sent to Islay Field on Saipan and started conducting daily bombing raids in the other Marianas against Japanese forces holding the Philippines and against the home islands of Japan. The crisis became so severe on the Japanese home front that Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was forced to resign his position. Moreover, Japanese propaganda on the home front ceased discussing battles with the Americans, noting their progress was getting closer to the homeland. It was clear by early 1944 that the tide of victory was starting to turn in the Pacific theater. The Japanese homeland was now under assault, and more Americans were getting closer and closer to the homeland of Japan.